The clinking of crystal wine glasses stopped dead. The rich, savory aroma of roasted turkey and spiced cranberry sauce hung heavy in the sudden suffocating silence of my dining room. Bradley, my 36-year-old son-in-law, slammed his fist on the solid mahogany table. The violent impact rattled the fine bone china and made the silver forks jump against the plates. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. His face was flushed a blotchy red from a mix of cheap arrogance and the expensive 20-year-old scotch I had personally paid for. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger right across the centerpiece, aiming it directly at my face. "Get out!" he spat, his voice echoing sharply off the high vaulted ceilings of the room. "You are not invited to sit at this table. This is my family's space." I slowly shifted my gaze to my daughter Rachel. She was 34 years old, a grown woman, but in that terrible moment, she looked exactly like a terrified child. She stared down at her empty porcelain plate, while her thin shoulders trembled noticeably under a heavy cashmere sweater. She did not say a single word. She did not attempt to defend me. She simply folded into herself, completely crushed and silenced under the weight of the man standing beside her. I did not yell back at him. I did not throw a tantrum, flip a plate, or curse at him. Uncontrolled anger is a severe liability that makes a man sloppy. I spent 40 years of my life building a massive construction equipment empire from the absolute dirt up. I have dealt with cutthroat site contractors, devastating economic market crashes, and men twice as ruthless as the overgrown boy standing across from me. You do not survive and thrive in that brutal industry by losing your temper. You survive by outsmarting your opponent. So I sat there for a brief, tense moment, letting his disrespectful outburst hang in the quiet air. I looked at his custom-tailored Italian suit, his ostentatious gold watch, and those overly manicured fingernails. I saw him for exactly what he was, a weak man playing dress-up with someone else's money. I calmly picked up my linen napkin, delicately dabbed the corners of my mouth, and placed it neatly next to my untouched plate. I stood up to my full height. I did not look at him with anger. I looked at him with the cold, absolute, terrifying certainty of a man who held every single winning card in the deck. I walked slowly past the grand dining table, my footsteps measured and deliberate. I grabbed my heavy winter coat from the hall tree near the entrance. I could feel Bradley's smug, toxic satisfaction radiating behind me. He actually thought he had won. He actually believed he was the master of the house, successfully kicking the supposedly senile old father-in-law out into the freezing Chicago winter night. I reached the heavy, solid oak front door of my mansion. I wrapped my hand around the freezing cold brass knob. Bradley crossed his arms confidently, leaning against the ornate archway of the dining room. "Do not let the door hit you on the way out." "Harrison," he sneered, dripping with venom. I did not look back. I simply turned the heavy brass knob and pulled the wide door open. The freezing December wind whipped violently into the grand foyer, carrying with it a flurry of biting snowflakes. But the bitter cold wind was not the only thing waiting outside on my front porch. When I pulled that door open, the guests waiting outside were about to permanently crush Bradley's pathetic existence. But to fully understand how this arrogant parasite ended up living in my home in the first place, how he dared to kick me out of the very property I bought with my late wife Martha, and exactly why I was standing at that door with the trap fully set, we have to rewind the clock. We have to go back exactly 4 months to a sweltering day in late August, to the exact moment he brought his designer suitcases onto my driveway and dragged his massive web of lies across my clean threshold. The late August heat was absolutely stifling, the kind of thick, oppressive, humid air that makes you want to stay strictly indoors with the central air conditioning running high. I was sitting comfortably in my leather recliner in the den, quietly reading the morning financial paper, when a massive commercial moving truck aggressively pulled up my long paved driveway. I watched through the front bay window, completely bewildered, as Bradley confidently stepped out of the passenger side. He looked sharp in a tailored navy suit, despite the blistering, unforgiving heat. Rachel slowly climbed out of the driver's side. She looked thoroughly exhausted, practically hiding inside a long-sleeved, oversized sweater that made absolutely no sense for the 85-degree summer weather. Before I could even put my shoes on and step outside to ask what in the world was going on, Bradley was already aggressively directing the hired movers to unload dozens of expensive leather suitcases and heavily packed designer wardrobe boxes right onto my clean front porch. I opened the door, thoroughly confused. Bradley instantly flashed me that polished, perfect $1,000,000 smile that always felt entirely rehearsed and utterly fake. He walked right up to my doorstep, extending a firm hand, as if he were closing a major corporate merger rather than randomly invading my private home. "Just a temporary hiccup, Harrison," he said smoothly, barely pausing to take a breath. "Our $2 million custom luxury build over in the Gold Coast is facing some highly unexpected delays. Supply chain issues, massive permitting nightmares with the city planners. You know exactly how these greedy contractors are. They constantly drag their feet just to bill more unnecessary hours. My vast capital is currently locked up tightly in a few long-term aggressive hedge funds, making liquid cash a bit too tight for a luxury rental right this very second. We just desperately need to crash on your spacious second floor for a few short months until the house is finally finished. I will pay you premium rent, of course. We will be totally out of your hair before you even know it." I looked right past his expensive suit to my daughter. Rachel was struggling to carry a heavy cardboard box of kitchen items. She absolutely refused to meet my questioning eyes. She stared blankly at the hot concrete steps, her posture rigid and defensive. She looked incredibly fragile, and my protective fatherly instinct immediately flared up like a roaring fire. A top-tier investment banker managing millions of dollars in client funds should not be essentially homeless due to a minor construction delay. The story felt too perfectly constructed, too smooth. But looking at Rachel's pale, defeated face, I knew I could not possibly turn them away in the heat. I nodded silently, stepping aside to let them drag their bags inside. That single, simple gesture of fatherly goodwill was the biggest, most catastrophic mistake I could have possibly made. I genuinely thought I was offering my only daughter a temporary, loving, safe harbor. I did not realize I was opening the front door to a ruthless man who had already laid the dark groundwork to permanently steal absolutely everything I owned. Within mere days, the entire dynamic of my peaceful home violently shifted. Bradley did not just move his clothes in. He launched a full-scale hostile takeover. First, he changed the house internet routing and the wireless passwords. When I asked him for the new access code to check my morning news, he dismissively waved his hand. "It is for corporate security, Harrison. I cannot have an unsecured local network while I am handling sensitive European market accounts. I will set up a guest network for you later." He never did. Then came the ultimate disrespect. My late wife Martha had a beautiful vintage sewing desk. She loved that desk. It was where she sat on Sunday mornings, where her laughter used to fill the upstairs hallway. One afternoon, I walked upstairs and found that desk shoved carelessly into the dirty, dusty corner of my garage next to the lawnmower. In its place, Bradley had installed massive black trading monitors and a heavy glass desk. He called it his temporary executive office. My chest tightened with a profound, aching grief, but I forced my face to remain entirely blank. I swallowed the burning anger rising in my throat. I knew if I reacted emotionally, he would use it against me. He would tell Rachel I was being unreasonable, so I let it happen. I played the part he expected. I became the tired, slightly senile, accommodating old father-in-law who just wanted to keep the peace. His arrogance grew completely unchecked. He set a rigid rule that I was not allowed in my own kitchen after 8 o'clock at night. He claimed the noise of me making my evening tea disturbed his crucial conference calls with international investors. He began treating me like a bothersome tenant in the very house my blood, sweat, and tears had paid for. I apologized, I nodded, and I stayed out of his way, observing every single move he made from the shadows. What bothered me most was his obsession with the mailbox. Every morning, Bradley would wake up at 6 sharp, marching straight to the end of the driveway to intercept the Daily Mail before I even had a chance to pour my coffee. He guarded that metal box like it was a federal vault. But one morning in late September, Bradley made a mistake. He drank far too much wine the night before and completely overslept. I walked out to the driveway in the crisp morning air, opened the mailbox, and found a thick, heavy envelope waiting inside. It was from my primary bank, sent via a secure, certified delivery service. My name was printed clearly on the front in bold black ink. Before I could even slide my thumb under the paper flap, the front door violently swung open. Bradley came rushing out in his silk bathrobe, his eyes wide with an unrestrained raw panic. He tried desperately to hide behind a wide, breathless smile. He practically sprinted down the driveway and snatched the envelope right out of my hands. "Just some pesky junk mail, Harrison." He laughed, his voice pitching slightly too high. "Credit card offers and local coupons. I will take this straight to the shredder for you. Do not want your identity getting stolen, right?" I looked at his trembling hands clutching my mail. I looked at the sweat forming on his brow despite the cool morning breeze. An old wolf who spent 4 decades navigating the brutal world of construction finance knows a liar when he sees one. I knew with absolute certainty that banks do not send grocery coupons in thick, certified security envelopes. I smiled warmly, giving him a slow, confused nod. "Thank you, Bradley," I said, making my voice sound weak and tired. "You are always looking out for me." He let out a heavy breath of relief and hurried back inside. He thought he had successfully handled a clueless old fool. He had absolutely no idea that his desperate little performance had just awakened a sleeping giant. The plausible lie was over. The silent war had officially begun, and I was going to systematically tear his entire life apart. To understand how this nightmare truly began, you have to rewind exactly 4 months. It was a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in late August. The kind of suffocating Illinois heat that makes the pavement shimmer and forces everyone indoors. I was sitting in my leather armchair in the den, sipping a glass of iced tea and reading the financial markets report. I am Harrison Cole. I am 70 years old, a widower, and a man who spent 40 grueling years building a heavy construction equipment company from a single rented bulldozer into a regional empire. I know the value of a dollar, and more importantly, I know the nature of the men who chase it. My wife Martha and I bought this estate in Lake Forest decades ago. It was our sanctuary. After she passed away 3 years ago, the sprawling halls felt too quiet, but it was mine, paid off in full and filled with her memory. My only daughter Rachel was 34, sweet-natured, but unfortunately prone to bending to loud, domineering personalities. That trait led her to marry Bradley 2 years ago. Bradley was 36, worked in high-stakes investment banking, and was the walking definition of a man trying too hard to look wealthy. On that suffocating August afternoon, the profound quiet of my home was shattered by the grinding diesel engine of a massive commercial moving truck pulling up my long paved driveway. I set my newspaper aside and walked to the front bay window. I frowned, completely bewildered. Bradley stepped out of the passenger side of the moving cab. Despite the blistering 85-degree heat and the crushing humidity, he was wearing a bespoke navy blue suit, an ostentatious gold watch, and a perfectly styled haircut. He looked completely out of place next to a dirty moving truck. A moment later, the driver's side door opened. Rachel slowly climbed down. The sight of my daughter immediately set off alarm bells in my head. She looked incredibly exhausted. Her skin was pale, her posture was slumped, and she was avoiding looking at the house. But the most glaring detail was her clothing. In the middle of an intense summer heatwave, Rachel was wearing a thick, oversized, long-sleeved sweater. She kept her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if she were trying to shield herself from the world. I opened my heavy oak front door and stepped onto the porch, just as Bradley aggressively directed the hired movers to start unloading a mountain of expensive designer luggage and heavy wardrobe boxes. He turned, spotted me, and immediately flashed a bright, highly rehearsed $1-million smile. It was the kind of slick, predatory grin I had seen on 100 desperate site contractors right before they asked for a loan extension. He walked briskly up the concrete steps and extended his hand with exaggerated confidence. "Just a temporary hiccup, Harrison," he announced smoothly, not even waiting for me to ask a single question. Our $2 million custom luxury build over in the Gold Coast is facing some highly unexpected delays. You know exactly how these things go in the real estate market. Supply chain issues, massive permitting nightmares with the city planners and lazy contractors dragging their feet to bill more unnecessary hours. I looked at him silently, not taking his hand. He quickly dropped it and chuckled, completely unfazed. My vast capital is currently locked up tightly in a few long-term aggressive hedge funds. He continued speaking rapidly to leave no room for interruption. Liquid cash is just a bit too tight for us to secure a luxury rental right this very second, not without taking a massive tax hit. We just desperately need to crash on your spacious second floor for a few short months until our new house is finally finished. I will pay you premium rent, of course, well above the market rate. We will be totally out of your hair before you even know it. It was a masterful, plausible lie. It had all the right buzzwords to sound legitimate to a layman. But I was not a layman. I knew that top-tier investment bankers pulling in 7 figures did not suddenly find themselves homeless over a minor construction delay. I knew that men with true wealth did not lock every single penny into illiquid assets. But I did not argue with him. Instead, I looked past his tailored shoulder directly at Rachel. She was struggling to carry a heavy cardboard box of kitchen utensils up the walkway. She absolutely refused to meet my eyes. She kept her head bowed, staring blankly at the ground. The thick sleeves of her sweater rode up slightly as she adjusted her grip on the heavy box, and I saw her flinch as the cardboard scraped her wrist. The sheer physical and emotional exhaustion radiating from my only child broke my heart. I knew that if I turned Bradley away, I would be turning her away too. I could not leave her isolated with a man I fundamentally mistrusted. I nodded slowly. You can use the 2 guest bedrooms on the east wing, I told him, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of emotion. But this is a quiet house, Bradley. I expect it to stay that way. He clapped his hands together, his fake smile widening. You are a lifesaver, Harrison. I promise you will not even notice we are here. The rent check will be on your kitchen counter on the 1st of every month. That promise, like everything else about Bradley, was an absolute fabrication. The 1st of September came and went. No rent check ever materialized on my counter. When I casually brought it up, Bradley waved his hand dismissively, claiming his offshore accounts were temporarily frozen due to a routine federal audit of his firm. By the 1st of October, he had a new excuse about a banking error. By November, he stopped offering excuses altogether, acting as if he owned the house and I was simply the live and maintenance man. I did not press the issue of the money. I had plenty of it, and arguing over rent would only give him an excuse to play the victim and manipulate Rachel. Instead, I stepped back and observed. I watched as he slowly and methodically took over my sanctuary. He completely disregarded my boundaries. But the most alarming behavior was not his blatant disrespect. It was his deep, consuming paranoia. It started with the morning mail. For my entire adult life, retrieving the mail had been my quiet morning ritual. I would walk down the long paved driveway at 8 in the morning, grab the stack of envelopes, and sort through them while drinking my black coffee. But the very week Bradley moved in, that routine was abruptly hijacked. I noticed that Bradley was setting his alarm for 6 in the morning. Long before the sun even fully rose, long before the delivery truck typically arrived, he would be pacing in the front foyer. He treated my standard metal mailbox at the end of the driveway like it was a maximum security vault holding state secrets. Every single morning he would march down the driveway, retrieve the stack of mail, and meticulously sort through it before bringing it inside. When I finally asked him why he was so obsessed with the postal delivery, he offered another smooth, calculated lie. Corporate security, Harrison, he said, not even looking up from his smartphone. I am handling highly sensitive European market accounts right now. I receive highly confidential physical documents that cannot risk being intercepted or misplaced. I am just making sure everything is handled properly. You do not have to worry about the chore anymore. He was managing European investment accounts from the second floor of my house, supposedly receiving confidential corporate documents to a residential suburban address. It was a laughable concept. But I simply nodded, playing the role of the tired, naive, trusting father-in-law. I let him believe he was the smartest man in the room, but my gut was screaming that something was fundamentally, dangerously wrong. A man who claims to be a millionaire does not hide from his own mail unless he is absolutely terrified of what is inside those envelopes. He was not looking for corporate documents. He was looking to intercept something specific, something he desperately needed to hide from me. And I was going to find out exactly what it was. While I waited for my opportunity to uncover his mailbox secret, the daily reality of living with Bradley rapidly deteriorated into a waking nightmare. He did not simply occupy the 2 guest bedrooms on the 2nd floor. He launched a full-scale hostile takeover of my entire property. It began with the house internet. One morning I sat down in the den with my tablet to check the morning stock market, only to find the wireless network completely locked. When I politely asked him for the new access code, he waved his hand dismissively, without even bothering to look up from his glowing laptop screen. "It is for strict corporate security, Harrison," he told me with a patronizing tone. "I cannot risk having an unsecured local network while I am handling highly sensitive European market accounts. I will set up a restricted guest network for you later today so you can check your emails." Of course, he never did. He deliberately cut off my digital access to the outside world, forcing me to rely on my limited cellular data just to read the morning news in my own home. But the technological disrespect was absolutely nothing compared to the profound emotional cruelty that swiftly followed. My late wife Martha had a beautiful vintage sewing desk. It was an exquisite piece of polished cherry wood that sat perfectly in the large upstairs alcove overlooking the sprawling back garden. She loved that desk immensely. It was where she spent countless Sunday mornings humming softly as she mended clothes or worked on intricate, colorful quilts. The soft sunlight would always catch her hair, and her gentle, melodic laughter used to fill that entire upstairs hallway. That desk was a sacred, untouchable piece of her memory. One afternoon, I walked up the grand staircase to water the hallway plants and stopped dead in my tracks. The beautiful alcove was completely empty. A cold, heavy knot immediately formed in the pit of my stomach as I rushed downstairs. I found Martha's precious sewing desk shoved carelessly into the dirty, dusty corner of my garage, wedged ruthlessly next to a greasy lawnmower and a stack of old paint cans. One of the delicate wooden legs was deeply scratched from being dragged brutally across the harsh concrete floor. In its place upstairs, Bradley had arrogantly installed massive black trading monitors, a heavy modern glass desk, and a tangled web of thick black cables. He proudly called the newly commandeered space his temporary executive office. My chest tightened with a profound, aching grief, a heavy, agonizing sorrow, mixed directly with a sudden, violent surge of pure adrenaline and anger. Every single protective instinct I possessed screamed at me to storm up those stairs, grab him by his expensive tailored collar, and throw him physically out onto the street. But I forced my face to remain entirely blank. I swallowed the burning anger rising in my throat until it tasted like bitter ash. I knew that if I reacted emotionally, he would instantly use it against me. He would run to tell Rachel I was being completely unreasonable and hostile. He would twist the narrative to make himself the helpless victim of an aggressive, unhinged old man. So I let it happen. I played the exact part he expected me to play. I became the tired, slightly senile, accommodating old father-in-law who just wanted to keep the peace at any absolute cost. My calculated silence only fueled his massive arrogance, allowing it to grow completely unchecked. Emboldened by my apparent submissiveness, he established a rigid set of rules for my own house. The most insulting mandate was the strict kitchen curfew. Bradley firmly announced that I was no longer allowed to enter the kitchen or the main living areas after 8 o'clock at night. He claimed the minor noise of me making my evening chamomile tea or preparing a late snack severely disturbed his crucial evening conference calls with major international investors. He began treating me like a bothersome, unwanted tenant in the very house my own blood, sweat, and tears had fully paid for decades ago. I apologized profusely. I nodded subserviently. I stayed strictly out of his way, retreating to my master bedroom early every single night without uttering a single word of complaint. But behind my closed door, I was observing every single move he made from the dark shadows, meticulously studying his daily patterns, his smooth lies, and his profound underlying paranoia. I was quietly waiting for him to make a mistake. And eventually, arrogant, greedy men always make a catastrophic mistake. It finally happened on a crisp, deeply cold Tuesday morning in late September. The night before, Brad Ali had hosted a loud, obnoxious dinner party for a large group of his so-called finance brothers. They had arrogantly drained 3 bottles of my most expensive aged scotch, filling the house with cheap cigar smoke and raucous entitled laughter until 2 in the morning. Consequently, for the first time since he had moved his bags into my home, Bradley severely overslept. He completely missed his obsessive 6:00 morning mailbox routine. I woke up at my usual time, got dressed, and stepped out into the brisk morning air. The autumn chill was just beginning to bite through my thin sweater. I walked slowly down the long, paved driveway, the dry fallen leaves crunching softly under my sturdy leather shoes. I reached the metal mailbox at the end of the road and pulled the heavy door open. Inside, resting quietly in the dark shadows, was a thick, incredibly heavy envelope. It was not a colorful credit card offer or a glossy real estate magazine. It was an official priority legal document from my primary financial institution, sent directly via a highly secure certified delivery service. My full legal name, Harrison Cole, was printed perfectly clear on the front in bold black ink. I stared at it, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. I had not requested any physical documents from my bank, and my routine account statements were entirely digital. I held the heavy envelope in my hand, running my thumb along the sealed flap. Just as I prepared to tear the paper open, the oak front door of the mansion swung open. Bradley came rushing out onto the porch wearing a loose silk bathrobe, his hair uncombed and messy. His eyes were wide with an unrestrained, raw panic that he tried desperately to hide behind a breathless smile. He sprinted barefoot down the cold concrete driveway, his chest heaving heavily. Before I could register his presence, he reached out and snatched the envelope out of my hands. "Just some pesky junk mail, Harrison." He laughed loudly, his voice pitched strangely high with poorly concealed anxiety. "I will take this straight to the shredder for you right now, so your identity stays safe." I looked at his trembling hands and the beads of cold sweat on his forehead. An old wolf who spent 40 years in business knows that banks do not send junk mail via certified delivery. I knew then he was hiding a devastating secret. The silent war had officially begun. I realized very quickly that confronting Bradley directly would yield absolutely nothing but more polished lies and aggressive manipulation. He was a master of the corporate pivot, highly trained to deflect and deny. If I pushed him on the strange certified mail or the strict kitchen curfews, he would simply tighten his grip on my household and isolate my daughter even further. So I deliberately changed my entire tactical approach. I completely stopped asking him questions. I stopped questioning his bizarre hours and his aggressive territorial claims over my late wife's beloved space. I faded entirely into the background of my own home, becoming a silent shadow. I focused every ounce of my sharp attention solely on Rachel. My daughter had always been a vibrant, joyful presence in this house. Growing up, her laughter was a constant melody that echoed off these high ceilings. Now she moved through the hallways like a frightened ghost, perpetually wrapped in those heavy, oversized sweaters, always keeping her head bowed submissively. She was shrinking right before my eyes. I needed to isolate her from his suffocating presence just for an hour to see what was truly going on beneath the surface. A few days later, an opportunity finally presented itself. Bradley announced he was driving down to the financial district for a critical in-person meeting with his firm's senior partners. The moment his luxury car pulled out of the driveway, the thick, oppressive tension in the house seemed to instantly dissipate. I casually walked into the kitchen and found Rachel nervously wiping down the granite countertops for the 3rd time. I told her I needed to run to the local upscale grocery market to pick up some specific ingredients for a pot roast, and I asked if she wanted to keep her old man company. She hesitated, glancing anxiously at the front door, but eventually nodded. The short drive to the market was agonizingly quiet. Rachel stared out the passenger window, her fingers picking nervously at the hem of her thick wool sweater. Inside the store, the bright fluorescent lights seemed to overwhelm her. We gathered our items slowly. I picked out a nice cut of beef, some fresh organic vegetables, a crusty loaf of artisanal bread, and a few small luxury items I knew she used to love, like a specific brand of dark chocolate truffles. When we reached the checkout lane, I stepped back to look at a magazine rack, allowing her to step up to the register. I watched closely from the periphery of my vision. The total came to roughly $150. It was a completely trivial amount for a family allegedly building a $2 million custom luxury mansion in the Gold Coast. Rachel pulled a sleek silver credit card from her wallet and handed it to the cashier. The young woman swiped the card through the machine. The terminal beeped a sharp negative tone. The cashier frowned, hit a few buttons on the screen, and swiped it again. Another sharp beep rang out. "I am so sorry, ma'am," the cashier said softly, looking at Rachel with a distinct, humiliating mixture of patience and genuine pity. "The card is coming up as completely declined. Do you happen to have another form of payment you would like to use today?" The color instantly drained from my daughter's face, leaving her completely ashen. She frantically dug through her leather purse, her hands shaking so violently that a tube of lipstick fell clattering onto the hard linoleum floor. She pulled out a second card, a standard blue debit card, and pushed it into the chip reader. She held her breath, her shoulders tense and elevated. The machine processed for a few agonizing seconds before loudly beeping again. Insufficient funds. Rachel looked like the floor had just dropped out from directly beneath her feet. She stared at the digital screen in sheer, unadulterated panic. Her breathing turned shallow and rapid. I quickly stepped forward smoothly, pulling a crisp $100 bill and a $50 from my money clip. I handed the cash directly to the cashier without saying a single word. I bagged the groceries myself, gently took Rachel by the elbow, and guided her out the automatic sliding doors into the parking lot. The moment the heavy doors closed behind us, Rachel broke down. She stopped right by the front bumper of my car and buried her face in her hands. "Dad, please, you cannot tell Bradley about this," she begged, her voice thick with hysterical tears. "He gave me that silver card specifically for household expenses. He told me the balance was fully paid off. If he finds out the transaction bounced, he will be absolutely furious with me. He will say I am not tracking the monthly budget correctly. You cannot tell him, please." I stood there in the quiet parking lot, holding the brown paper bags, feeling a cold, dark realization settle deep into my bones. A top-tier investment banker pulling in an alleged 7-figure salary does not have a wife whose credit cards bounce over $150 worth of basic groceries. A man managing massive European hedge funds does not leave his spouse standing humiliated at a checkout counter with absolutely zero available cash. This was not a simple clerical banking error. This was systemic, deliberate financial starvation. He was completely controlling her access to money. I promised her I would not say a word, and we drove back in heavy silence. For the next several days, I observed their dynamic with a renewed, terrifying clarity. I noticed things I had previously brushed off. Every single time Bradley's mobile phone rang a sharp, shrill tone that constantly interrupted the quiet house, Rachel would physically flinch. Her eyes would dart around the room, instantly calculating his mood before he even answered the call. If he sighed heavily, she would quickly leave the room. If he spoke in a sharp, clipped tone, she would immediately begin cleaning something, trying desperately to look busy and invisible. It was the distinct behavioral pattern of a hostage, not a cherished wife. My mind raced with dark possibilities. Where was his supposed massive income actually going? Why were they truly hiding out in my suburban home? The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, but the picture forming was incredibly ugly. I knew I needed raw, unfiltered information, the kind he would never volunteer during daylight hours. That opportunity finally arrived late one Thursday night. It was around 2 in the morning. The entire mansion was perfectly still silent, except for the low, rhythmic hum of the central heating unit. I woke up with a dry throat and decided to head downstairs for a glass of cold water. To get to the main staircase, I had to walk directly past the second-floor alcove, the space that used to hold Martha's sewing desk, the space Bradley now called his executive office. As I quietly padded down the carpeted hallway in my slippers, I noticed a thin slice of yellow light spilling out from beneath his office door. The door was cracked open just a tiny fraction of an inch. I stopped completely. I did not make a single sound. I held my breath, standing perfectly still in the dark hallway. Bradley was pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor. I could hear the soft, agitated thud of his bare feet. He was speaking on his cellular phone, his voice hushed and frantically urgent. He was certainly not speaking to any wealthy European clients about global market fluctuations or aggressive hedge fund yields. He was practically whispering, his tone laced with a desperate, pleading edge I had never heard from him before. "Valerie, you have to calm down and just give me a little more time," he whispered into the phone. "The payout is coming, I promise you. I am expediting the paperwork as fast as I possibly can without raising any major red flags. The old fool is practically sleepwalking through life down there. He signs absolutely whatever I slide across the breakfast table. He does not read a single line of print. I just need you to be patient for a few more weeks. Do not do anything stupid. Once this massive payout fully clears the secondary accounts, I am booking the flights, and we are gone. I will have more than enough cash to cover the lease and the car. Just wait for the final transfer." I stood frozen in the dark corridor, my heart hammering violently against my ribcage. The cold, sickening truth washed over me in an instant. There were no European clients. There was no delayed custom luxury build in the Gold Coast. There was only a desperate man named Bradley, a mysterious woman named Valerie, and a massive impending payout that apparently required my blind signature. He was not just an arrogant freeloader taking advantage of my hospitality. He was a predator actively executing a calculated plot to drain my resources and fund a secret life. And judging by the absolute desperation in his hushed midnight whispers, the final trap was already set, and I was standing directly in the center of the crosshairs. I knew perfectly well that directly confronting him about the intercepted bank envelope would be an absolute waste of my time. A man like Bradley did not operate in the realm of honest conversation. He operated in the murky, deceitful waters of corporate spin and aggressive deflection. If I demanded to see the contents of that certified letter, he would have instantly manufactured a brilliant excuse. He would have claimed it was a misplaced tax document, a routine credit inquiry, or a boring administrative notice that he had already handled for my convenience. More importantly, showing my hand would only force him to tighten his grip on my household and isolate my daughter even further. I needed raw, unfiltered intelligence, and I needed to gather it without him ever suspecting that the clueless old man was actually watching his every single move. I decided to treat my own home like a hostile corporate boardroom. In the heavy construction business, when you suspect a subcontractor is padding their invoices or cutting dangerous corners on a job site, you do not immediately call them into the office to yell at them. You quietly audit their materials, you monitor their arrival times from a distance, and you build an airtight case before you ever let them know they are under the microscope. I needed a flawless, natural excuse to bypass his aggressive perimeter and get inside that second-floor office. He guarded that room fiercely, constantly snapping the door shut whenever I walked down the hallway. I had to create a scenario where my presence in his self-proclaimed executive sanctuary was completely justified and entirely innocent. My silver reading glasses became the perfect bait. I deliberately started misplacing them around the house over the next few days. I would leave them on the kitchen island, on the coffee table in the den, and out on the patio chair. I wanted Bradley and Rachel to get completely used to the sight of me wandering around the property, patting my pockets, and harmlessly complaining about my failing memory. I played the role of the forgetful, harmless 70-year-old father-in-law to absolute perfection. The opportunity to plant the trap finally arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Rachel had driven down to the local pharmacy to pick up a few prescriptions, and Bradley was downstairs in the grand foyer, loudly berating a customer service representative over his delayed dry cleaning. I quietly slipped up the carpeted grand staircase and walked straight into the upstairs alcove that used to be my late wife's sewing room. The space felt cold and entirely foreign. The massive black trading monitors sat heavily on the sleek glass desk, surrounded by a chaotic mess of charging cables and empty coffee mugs. I stepped forward and carefully placed my silver reading glasses right on the edge of the glass desk, resting them just behind his secondary monitor. They were partially hidden, but entirely visible if you knew exactly where to look. I turned around, walked back downstairs, and settled comfortably into my leather recliner in the den to wait. I did not have to wait very long. The following afternoon, the house was dead quiet. Rachel had gone out again this time to a doctor appointment she had barely mentioned. I was sitting in the den reading a historical biography when I heard the distinct, aggressive tone of Bradley's voice echoing down the grand staircase. He was on a phone call, and he was clearly agitated. He was not using his smooth, polished, professional voice. He was speaking with a frantic, desperate edge that immediately sent a cold chill running straight down my spine. This was my window. I slowly stood up from my recliner and began the ascent up the stairs. I took each step with extreme caution, placing my feet carefully on the outer edges of the wooden treads to avoid making even the slightest creaking sound. My heart was beating with a slow, heavy rhythmic thud against my ribs. I reached the top landing and crept silently down the long corridor. As I approached the alcove, I saw exactly what I had been hoping for. The heavy oak door was cracked open just a fraction of an inch. I pressed my back firmly against the hallway wall, keeping myself completely hidden in the dark shadows just outside his line of sight. I held my breath, focusing every ounce of my attention on the narrow gap in the doorway. Bradley was pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor. I could hear the sharp, agitated scuff of his leather shoes turning sharply on the expensive Persian rug. "Valerie, you have to stop calling me during the day," he hissed into the phone, his voice dripping with pure venom and barely suppressed panic. "I already told you the money is secured. Just process the final paperwork on your end and stop nagging me." I stood frozen. He was not talking to a European investor. He was not negotiating a complex supply chain logistics issue for his supposed $2 million luxury build in the Gold Coast. He was coordinating something dark, something urgent, with a woman named Valerie. "I do not care how long the transfer takes, you just have to wait." Bradley continued, his tone turning incredibly cruel and dismissive. "The old fool is losing his mind anyway. He has absolutely no idea what is going on. He signs whatever I put in front of him." A suffocating wave of ice-cold dread washed over my entire body. My hands calloused from decades of gripping cold steel and steering heavy machinery slowly curled into tight, unforgiving fists by my sides. I just slide the documents under a stack of mundane utility bills, and he blindly scribbles his name at the bottom, without even putting his reading glasses on. Bradley laughed, a dark, sinister sound that made my stomach churn. He does not read a single line of print. He thinks I am just handling the household administrative duties to be a helpful son-in-law. Once this massive payout fully clears the secondary offshore accounts, I will trigger the medical evaluation. I will throw him in a cheap state-run, nursing home claim power of attorney, and we take the entire estate. Just stick to the damn plan and do not ruin this for us." He abruptly ended this call, tossing his phone onto the glass desk with a loud, aggressive clatter. I remained pressed against the cold drywall of the corridor, my breathing completely suspended. The sheer magnitude of his sinister deception hit me like a physical blow to the chest. He was not just a greedy, arrogant freeloader taking advantage of my spacious home and my quiet hospitality. He was not just dodging rent or intercepting bank letters to hide a temporary financial setback. He was a highly calculated, incredibly ruthless predator. He was actively plotting to medically condemn me completely, strip me of my legal rights, and steal the very house I had built for my family. I needed absolute proof to destroy his life. The silent war was over. The gloves were now off. The chilling echo of Bradley's hushed midnight conversation reverberated through my mind long after I retreated to my bedroom. I did not sleep a single wink that night. I lay flat on my back in the suffocating darkness, staring blankly up at the ceiling, my mind racing through 4 decades of corporate warfare. I had dealt with ruthless developers who would gladly sell their own mothers for a profit margin. But this was an entirely different evil. This was a man sleeping under my roof, eating at my table, and actively plotting to strip away my freedom and steal the sanctuary I had built for my late wife. The raw, burning rage threatened to completely consume me. But uncontrolled anger is the death of strategy. I needed to remain perfectly calm. I needed undeniable, concrete proof of his financial crimes before I launched my counteroffensive. The next morning, the house was draped in a tense, manufactured normalcy. I walked into the kitchen at exactly 7:00, pouring myself a cup of black coffee just as Bradley strode confidently into the room. He was dressed in a pristine white polo shirt, khaki trousers, and loafers. He looked incredibly relaxed, humming a cheerful tune as he poured a glass of orange juice. "Heading to the country club this morning, Harrison," he announced with a sickening, rehearsed smile. "I have 18 holes scheduled with an overseas investor. I probably will not be back until late this evening. Rachel is upstairs resting, so try to keep the noise down, will you?" I forced a warm, vacant smile onto my face and simply nodded. "Have a productive game, Bradley," I replied, my voice flawlessly steady and devoid of the fury boiling just beneath my skin. I stood by the window and watched his silver sedan back slowly out of my driveway. I waited exactly 15 minutes to ensure he was fully gone before I sprang into action. I went upstairs, quickly put on my charcoal suit, grabbed my leather briefcase, and walked out to my car. I did not bother leaving a note. My destination was the primary branch of my bank, located right in the downtown commercial district. The drive into the city felt agonizingly slow, though my mind operated at a rapid pace. I thought about the Lake Forest estate. Martha and I had purchased that property 30 years ago, when my construction equipment company finally broke through the regional market. I had paid off the entire massive mortgage over a decade ago. It was my ultimate financial fortress, an impenetrable asset designed to provide absolute security for Rachel. The thought of Bradley's greasy hands touching that legacy made my grip on the steering wheel tighten until my knuckles turned a bruised, ghostly white. I pulled into the bank parking lot, shut off the engine, and took one long, incredibly deep breath to completely center my emotions. When I walked through those heavy glass double doors, I did not stop at the standard teller line. I bypassed the crowded lobby and walked straight toward the private executive offices in the back. I knocked once on the heavy frosted glass door of the branch manager and pushed it open. David Lawson looked up from his polished mahogany desk, his face breaking into a bright, genuine smile. David and I went back more than 2 decades. He had personally handled the commercial loans that allowed me to expand my equipment fleet in the late 90s, and he had expertly managed my private wealth accounts ever since I officially retired. He was a meticulous old-school banker who valued firm handshakes and absolute discretion. "Harrison, what an unexpected pleasure," David said, standing up quickly and extending his firm hand across the desk. "I thought you were spending your retirement perfecting your golf swing, not slumming it down here in the financial district. Please take a seat. What brings you into the branch today?" I shook his hand firmly and sat down in the plush leather guest chair. I did not engage in the usual friendly pleasantries. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and looked him directly in the eyes, with a completely humorless expression. "David, I need to see the exact details of the certified priority envelope your office sent to my residential address earlier this week," I said, keeping my tone strictly professional, but laced with an undeniable heavy urgency. "There has been a significant breakdown in communication regarding my household finances, and I need to manually review the recent transactional history of my primary estate accounts immediately." David leaned back in his leather chair, his warm smile slowly fading into a look of profound, genuine confusion. He furrowed his brow, pulling his reading glasses down from the top of his head. He began typing rapidly on his sleek computer keyboard, his eyes scanning the glowing monitor. "A certified letter, Harrison?" he asked, his voice trailing off slightly as he read the screen. "Well, yes, we dispatched the final confirmation documents via secure courier last Tuesday. But I must admit, I am a bit confused by your visit today. Your son-in-law Bradley explicitly assured me during our phone call yesterday afternoon that you had received the finalized paperwork and were completely satisfied with the incredibly swift processing time. The air in the luxurious executive office suddenly felt thick and incredibly difficult to breathe. My heart performed a slow, sickening drop directly into my stomach. "Bradley called you yesterday?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain perfectly level despite the raging alarm bells clanging violently inside my head. "And what exactly did Bradley tell you about my satisfaction with the processing time, David? What paperwork are we discussing?" David stopped typing. He looked across the desk at me, his professional demeanor instantly shifting into a state of high alert. He folded his hands together tightly. "Harrison, your $800,000 HELOC cleared last week," he said slowly. "The home equity line of credit you requested against the total equity of your Lake Forest estate. The certified letter was simply the final confirmation that the underwriting process was fully complete. The entire $800,000 lump sum cleared underwriting and was wired directly into the private corporate LLC account you authorized last Thursday morning." The silence that followed his words was absolute. Bradley had successfully orchestrated a massive, devastating financial strike right under my nose. David quickly reached into his filing cabinet, pulled out a thick manila folder, and extracted a glossy white document. He slid the heavy piece of paper across the polished mahogany desk toward me. "Harrison, you submitted the primary authorization forms via digital scan 2 weeks ago," David explained. "We have the fully notarized signature page right here on file." I slowly reached out and pulled the crisp white document toward me. My eyes locked directly onto the bottom right corner. Right there, resting clearly on the black ink line next to the bright red notary stamp, was my signature. It was a forgery. Bradley had secretly, maliciously mortgaged my fully paid-off home. My fists clenched until my nails dug deeply into my palms. I stared at the forged signature on the crisp white paper, feeling absolute betrayal slice through my chest. David sat quietly behind his mahogany desk, watching my face contort with horror. He asked if I needed cold water, his voice tight with concern. I slowly released my deep breath, unclenched my bleeding hands, and slid the fraudulent authorization form back across the wood. I told David there had been a severe miscommunication, and I instructed him to freeze all outbound transfers from my primary accounts immediately. I did not yell. I did not flip the heavy desk or smash the glass. I thanked him profusely for his incredibly valuable time, picked up my worn leather briefcase, and walked out of the bank with measured steps. The burning urge to drive straight back to Lake Forest kicked down the door of Martha's old sewing room, and physically drag Bradley out onto the street roared in my ears like a freight train. But uncontrolled anger is a severe liability. Anger gets you an assault charge. Strategy gets you absolute justice. Strategy is a weapon, and I was about to arm myself to the teeth. I climbed into my car, merged onto the highway, and headed straight into the dense concrete heart of downtown Chicago. I navigated through the heavy city traffic and pulled into the underground parking garage of a towering high-rise on Wacker Drive. I took the express elevator directly to the 42nd floor, stepping out into the immaculate reception area of Barnes & Associates. Victor Barnes was not just a highly priced corporate attorney. He was an old, fiercely loyal friend who had successfully defended my construction company against ruthless corporate raiders 3 decades ago. He was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who viewed the law not as a shield, but as a scalpel. I bypassed the receptionist, who recognized me instantly, and walked straight into Victor's expansive corner office. He was sitting at a massive marble conference table reviewing a thick stack of legal briefs. Sitting across from him was a sharp-featured woman in a gray pantsuit. She possessed cold, highly calculating eyes that immediately assessed my posture and my demeanor the second I walked through the door. Victor stood up, his face breaking into a grim, knowing expression. Harrison, Victor said, gesturing to the empty leather chair next to him. I want to introduce you to Sarah Jenkins. She is a former federal investigator and the absolute best private intelligence operative in the Midwest. Take a seat and tell us exactly what you found at the bank today. I sat down and slowly slid the color photocopy across the marble table. Bradley secretly took out an $800,000 home equity line of credit against my estate. I explained, my voice echoing slightly. He blatantly forged my digital signature, intercepted the certified banking confirmation, and transferred the entire sum into an obscure account. Furthermore, I overheard him plotting with a woman named Valerie. He explicitly plans to use this fabricated financial distress to declare me medically incompetent, throw me into a state facility, and completely seize control of my remaining assets. Victor stared at the document, his jaw tightening. He slowly passed the paper to Sarah, who scrutinized the forged signature with a small magnifying loupe. This is a brazen, highly aggressive maneuver, Victor stated, his voice dropping an octave. What he has done constitutes federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and severe elder financial abuse. Legally, we could walk into a precinct right now, hand them this document, and have him arrested. I shook my head firmly. An arrest is not nearly enough, I told them. If we hand him over, he will hire a brilliant defense attorney. He will claim I authorized the transfer and simply forgot. He will weaponize my age against me in front of a jury. I want his entire clandestine network dragged into the light. I want to destroy him completely. Sarah leaned back in her chair, a slight approving smile playing on her lips. I like how you think, Harrison, she said, her voice crisp and highly professional. Victor is right about the federal charges, but you are absolutely correct about the trial defense. To nail a slippery financial predator like Bradley permanently, we need undeniable hard proof of where the stolen funds were routed. We need the digital footprints, the offshore account numbers, the encrypted communication logs, and the explicit financial connection to this Valerie woman. We need the raw data hidden on those massive trading monitors sitting in your upstairs alcove. The problem is getting to them. You said he guards that room fiercely and locks the network. I nodded, confirming her assessment. He practically sleeps in that room. He has cut off my internet access and treats the second floor like a sovereign nation. Victor folded his hands. That means you have to go back into that house and play the role of the clueless old man better than you have ever played it before, he instructed gravely. You cannot show anger, confront him, or let Rachel know what is happening. Her panic will tip him off. You must be the forgetful, docile father-in-law he believes you to be, swallowing your pride completely. I spent 40 years smiling at treacherous men while silently plotting their financial ruin, I replied. I can easily handle Bradley for a few more days. Just tell me exactly what I need to do to breach his security. Sarah reached down and lifted a heavy black case onto the marble table. She snapped the metal latches open, revealing equipment nested securely in dense foam. She carefully extracted two small, peculiar items. The first was a sleek metallic device that looked identical to a standard portable hard drive. The second was a tiny object no larger than a shirt button, with a minuscule glass lens perfectly embedded in the center. This is a military-grade cloning device, Sarah explained, holding up the black rectangle. You do not need any passwords. Once plugged into his computer's USB port, it automatically bypasses his security and mirrors his entire hard drive. It operates silently and leaves absolutely no digital trace. She carefully placed it down and held up the button. This is a dedicated cellular microcamera. I need you to securely attach this to the underside of the bookshelf directly facing his desk. It will give me a live, continuous feed of his computer screens and allow me to capture his keystrokes when he manually enters his passwords. I looked at the advanced technology, understanding the severe physical risk involved. If he catches me plugging this drive into his machine, The situation will immediately become violent, I noted quietly. He is fighting for a massive payout. Sarah nodded, her expression turning incredibly serious. That is exactly why this mission requires flawless timing and absolute precision. She slid the devices across the smooth marble surface directly into my waiting hands. I need 15 minutes alone with his computers, Harrison. You have to get him out of that room. I looked at the sleek metallic cloning device and the tiny micro camera resting in the palm of my hand. I nodded at Sarah, memorizing the exact instructions she laid out for me. Getting Bradley out of that office for 15 uninterrupted minutes was not going to be a matter of brute force. It was going to require a masterful manipulation of his own colossal ego. Fortunately, Bradley provided the perfect opportunity the very next evening. He had decided to host what he obnoxiously called a strategic networking dinner for a group of his finance brothers. These were men who wore suits that cost more than a reliable used car, men who spoke entirely in corporate jargon and measured their self-worth by the price tag on their watches. At 5:00 that afternoon, Bradley found me in the kitchen. I was slowly pouring a glass of water, making sure my hands trembled just slightly. He stood in the doorway, straightening his silk tie, his chest puffed out with arrogant authority. Harrison. I have some highly important associates coming over tonight, he announced, his tone dripping with patronizing condescension. We are discussing a massive merger, and I need absolute focus. I am going to have to ask you to remain in your master suite for the duration of the evening. I cannot have you wandering out here in your slippers interrupting the flow of a multi-million-dollar conversation. I need the main floor completely clear. Do you understand? I let a look of mild, pathetic confusion cross my features. I blinked slowly, looking down at my trembling hands. Of course, Bradley, I murmured, my voice appropriately frail and submissive. I was just going to watch a history documentary anyway. I will stay out of your hair. Have a wonderful evening with your friends. He smiled clearly, thrilled by my absolute compliance. He turned on his heel and marched toward the dining room to inspect the catered food he had undoubtedly paid for, using the funds he stole from my home equity line. I carried my water glass back to the master suite and quietly locked the door. I did not turn on the television. I sat down in the dark on the edge of my bed, fully dressed in dark clothing, waiting for the charade to begin. By 7:00, the massive house was vibrating with the loud, entitled voices of Bradley and his guests. The heavy bass of modern jazz music pulsed through the floorboards. I carefully opened my bedroom door just a fraction of an inch and listened to the chaos echoing from the grand dining room downstairs. I could hear the distinct, sharp clinking of crystal tumblers. They were violently draining the bottles of my 20-year-old single malt scotch that Martha had bought for me as an anniversary gift. I could hear Bradley holding court, his voice booming over the music. He was bragging incessantly. He was boasting about his incredible investment yields, the supposed luxury mansion he was building in the Gold Coast, and the sheer financial brilliance he brought to every single deal. He was completely drunk on expensive liquor and his own fabricated grandiosity. This was his fatal flaw. When Bradley felt wealthy and powerful, he became utterly oblivious to his surroundings. I checked my watch. It was exactly 8:15. The timing had to be absolutely flawless. Sarah had texted me 10 minutes earlier from a secure burner phone confirming she was parked 2 blocks away and approaching the property on foot. I slipped out of my master bedroom and moved silently down the darkened second-floor hallway. I bypassed his closed office door and made my way to the rear servant staircase. These stairs led directly down to the back utility hallway, far away from the dining room, where the party was raging. I descended the narrow wooden steps, placing my weight on the outer edges to muffle any sound. The loud bursts of laughter from the dining room masked my movements perfectly. I reached the heavy glass back door that opened onto the rear patio. The night was pitch black, thick with a heavy autumn fog that obscured the manicured lawn. I unlocked the deadbolt with a soft metallic click and gently pulled the door open. Sarah materialized out of the heavy fog like an absolute phantom. She was dressed completely in matte black, her dark hair pulled back tightly. She carried a slim, specialized backpack over her shoulder. She did not say a single word. She just gave me a curt, professional nod. I stepped back and she slipped past me into the house. Her footsteps made absolutely zero sound on the tile floor. It was incredible to watch a true professional at work. We moved together up the rear staircase, two silent ghosts haunting a house currently occupied by loud, arrogant fools. When we reached the second-floor landing, I pointed silently down the hall toward the cracked door of Martha's old sewing room. The glow of Bradley's massive monitors spilled out into the dark corridor. Sarah moved swiftly down the hallway, keeping her body pressed close to the wall. I stood guard at the top of the main grand staircase, my heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I had a clear, unobstructed view of the foyer and the arched entryway to the dining room below. I could hear Sarah slip inside the office. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was attaching the micro camera to the underside of the bookshelf, angling it to capture the keyboard. Then she was plugging the military-grade cloning device into the main tower of his computer setup. 15 minutes. That was all she needed to mirror every single piece of encrypted data, every hidden offshore account number, and every treacherous communication log with the mysterious Valerie. The minutes dragged on like hours. 5 minutes passed. The loud conversation downstairs shifted from the stock market to expensive sports cars. Bradley was laughing uproariously at a joke someone made. 8 minutes passed. I gripped the wooden banister tightly, my palms slick with cold sweat. I prayed that Sarah's device was downloading the data as rapidly as she promised. 10 minutes. The jazz music downstairs suddenly skipped to a new track, creating a brief, terrifying lull in the ambient noise. Then the absolute worst-case scenario unfolded right before my very eyes. Bradley's booming voice suddenly rose above the low murmur of his colleagues. "Gentlemen, hold that thought," he announced loudly. "I have a box of incredibly rare Cuban cigars in my office upstairs. I completely forgot to bring down the specialized cutter. Give me one quick second." My blood ran completely cold. I stared down the grand staircase as Bradley stepped out of the dining room archway and into the main foyer. He was holding an empty crystal glass, his face flushed red from the heavy alcohol. He placed his hand on the polished wooden banister and took his first heavy step onto the bottom stair. I looked frantically back down the dark hallway. Sarah was still inside. He was coming upstairs right now. There was no time to panic. There was only time to act. Bradley was 3 steps up the grand staircase, his heavy footsteps thudding against the polished wood. If he reached the top landing, he would have a direct line of sight straight down the carpeted corridor. He would instantly catch Sarah red-handed with the cloning device plugged into his computer, and all of my leverage would evaporate. I had to stop his upward momentum immediately. I spun around and rushed quietly back toward the master suite, my eyes frantically scanning the shadows for a distraction. Resting quietly on a small decorative mahogany table near my bedroom door was a half-empty bottle of cheap red wine Rachel had nervously poured earlier that afternoon, along with a large crystal goblet. I grabbed the glass, my fingers wrapping tightly around the thick stem, and filled it to the absolute brim with the dark crimson liquid. I stepped back out into the hall just as Bradley reached the halfway point of the staircase. The loud jazz music from the dining room masked my approach. I forced my hands to shake violently, channeling my adrenaline into a performance of frail confusion. I shuffled forward, adopting the hunched, unsteady gait of a senile old man. I moved directly to the top of the stairs, perfectly positioning my body to physically block his path. Bradley looked up, his flushed face instantly twisting into a mask of pure irritation. "Harrison, what in the world are you doing out of your room?" he barked aggressively, his loud voice echoing over the heavy music below. "I specifically told you to stay put. Get out of my way." He lunged upward, impatient and aggressive, attempting to brush past me on the narrow landing. I did not step aside. Instead, I leaned directly into his path and deliberately tripped. I pitched forward, throwing my weight toward him. The heavy crystal goblet tilted downward, and the entire volume of dark red wine cascaded through the air in a perfect, unavoidable arc. The crimson liquid hit him dead center in the chest, splashing violently across the pristine white fabric of his expensive polo shirt and soaking deep into his tailored khaki trousers. The crystal glass slipped from my grip and tumbled down the wooden stairs, shattering into 100 glittering pieces near the bottom step. The sudden crash brought the house to a dead halt. The laughter in the dining room instantly evaporated. Several of his finance friends stepped out into the grand foyer, their drinks frozen in their hands, staring up in total shock. For one agonizing second, Bradley just stood there. He looked down at the massive spreading red stain ruining his thousands of dollars worth of custom clothing. His jaw dropped. The veins in his thick neck bulged. When he finally looked back up at me, his eyes were completely black with terrifying rage. "You stupid, clumsy old fool!" he roared, his voice tearing through the silent house like a physical weapon. The sheer volume of his scream made the crystal chandelier vibrate. "Look at what you just did to me. This is a $3,000 custom silk blend. It is completely ruined." I immediately folded into myself, sinking my shoulders and bowing my head defensively. I raised my trembling hands in the air, playing the terrified elder. "I am so sorry, Bradley," I stammered, making my voice fragile. "I did not see you. I am incredibly sorry." "Do not give me your pathetic excuses," he spat, taking a threatening step up the stairs so he was towering directly over me. "You are nothing but a useless, senile old burden. I manage your pathetic little life. I let you breathe my air, and this is how you repay me, by humiliating me in front of my high-level associates. You are a walking disaster, Harrison. A total, absolute, unmitigated disaster." He was screaming right into my face. Drops of spittle hit my cheek. I kept my head bowed, staring at the floorboards, taking every single ounce of his venomous abuse without uttering a word of defense. I let him call me useless. I let him completely strip away my dignity in front of strangers. Because while he was busy screaming at me, while he was entirely focused on his ruined clothing and his bruised ego, the seconds were ticking by. 10 seconds, 30 seconds, a full minute. I was doing the math in my head, calculating the exact amount of time Sarah needed to pull the cloning device, retrieve her camera, and slip safely out the window. "You are confined to that room for the rest of the week," Bradley shouted, his voice cracking with pure fury. "You do not come out. You stay out of my sight until I figure out exactly what to do with you. Now get out of my face." He shoved roughly past me, his shoulder slamming hard against my chest, but he did not head toward his office. The distraction had worked perfectly. Consumed by rage and dripping with sticky red wine, he stormed down the hallway toward the master bathroom. The heavy door slammed shut with a violent crack. I stood alone on the landing, slowly lowering my trembling hands. The facade of the terrified old man instantly melted away, replaced by the cold focus of a predator. I glanced down the dark corridor toward the sewing room. The office door was pulled shut. There was no shadow moving anywhere. Sarah had successfully slipped out the window, vanishing back into the thick autumn fog. The guests downstairs muttered uncomfortable excuses and began shuffling out the front door, abandoning their arrogant host. I retreated to my bedroom, locked the door, and washed the sticky residue of wine from my hands. The physical humiliation was a cheap price to pay. Bradley had absolutely no idea that he had just handed me the very keys to his complete destruction. The next 48 hours were a grueling test of my patience. I stayed confined to my room just as he had demanded. I ate meager meals. I did not contact Rachel, allowing the heavy tension to solidify. I knew that Sarah and Victor were working around the clock, decrypting the cloned hard drive and analyzing the hidden video feed. I waited for the final confirmation. It finally came late Saturday afternoon. The sky outside my window was bruised purple and gray, threatening a heavy thunderstorm. I was sitting in my armchair when my secure burner phone, hidden deep inside my hollowed-out dictionary, began to vibrate. I pressed it to my ear. Harrison Sarah said, her usually calm and highly professional voice sounding incredibly strained, almost breathless with shock. "Do you have it?" I asked quietly, keeping my eyes fixed directly on my locked bedroom door. I have everything, she replied, the sound of rapid typing echoing faintly in the background. We cracked the final encryption layer 20 minutes ago. Victor is reviewing the offshore transactional logs. You need to leave that house right now and get straight down to my office. You are not going to believe what this bastard has been doing. The drive back into downtown Chicago felt like plunging straight into the cold heart of a massive hurricane. A torrential downpour lashed violently against my cracked windshield, obscuring the towering city skyline. I navigated the flooded city streets with cold precision, ignoring the blaring horns of angry rush-hour traffic and the blinding flash of lightning. I parked in the underground garage on Wacker Drive, marching toward the express elevator with a heavy heart. I was consumed by a singular, unyielding purpose that drowned out the freezing autumn chill. When the elevator doors slid open on the 42nd floor, I completely bypassed the reception desk. I walked purposefully down the long hallway and pushed open the heavy glass door to the corner conference room. Victor Barnes and Sarah Jenkins were already seated at the massive marble table waiting for my arrival. The cloning device I had planted in Bradley's office 2 nights prior rested in the center of the table, connected to Sarah's silver laptop. Stacks of freshly printed paper were spread across the marble surface, forming a terrifying physical map of pure deception. "Take a seat," Harrison Victor commanded, his voice unnervingly quiet in the large room. He did not offer any professional pleasantries or meaningless small talk. He simply gestured toward the plush leather chair directly across from the glowing computer screen. I sat down slowly, keeping my eyes locked on the mountain of incriminating documents spread before me. "Tell me exactly what we are looking at," I said, my voice perfectly steady, betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Sarah spun her laptop around so I could see the screen clearly. She pulled up a digital dossier filled with corporate emails, bank statements, and legal notices. "We spent the last 48 hours decrypting your son-in-law's mirrored hard drive." Sarah began, her tone surgically precise. "Bradley is not a high-level investment banker managing European hedge funds, Harrison. He has not executed a single market trade in almost a year. He was terminated from his firm exactly 8 months ago." I stared at her, absorbing the raw magnitude of the lie. "He has been leaving my house in a tailored suit every morning since August," I replied slowly. "He was playing dress-up," Victor interjected sharply. "His former partners quietly forced him out to avoid a massive public scandal. Bradley was caught embezzling client funds to cover his catastrophic gambling debts on risky short-term options. He has absolutely no income, no corporate portfolio, and 0 frozen assets. That $2 million custom luxury mansion in the Gold Coast does not exist. We pulled the county land registry records. He never purchased a single square foot of property in that district." A cold silence filled the room as the absolute scale of his fabricated reality settled over me. Every arrogant boast at the dinner table, every hushed phone call about international supply chain issues, every demand for a perfectly quiet house during his evening conference calls. It was all a masterfully constructed stage play designed to mask his total financial ruin. "But that does not explain the $800,000 he stole from my home equity line," I stated, pointing at the stack of bank wire transfers. "If he is entirely broke and unemployed, where exactly did my money go?" Sarah pulled a thick blue folder from the bottom of the stack and slid it smoothly across the marble table. She opened the cover, revealing a series of glossy photographs and lease agreements. "It went to Valerie," Sarah said simply, watching my face to gauge my reaction. I looked down at the top photograph. It showed a vibrant, highly attractive blonde woman smiling brightly while leaning against the hood of a sleek, brand-new silver sports car. "Valerie is 24 years old," Sarah explained, tracing her finger over the printed background check. "She is a local fitness instructor who lives in a highly exclusive luxury condominium building downtown. The $800,000 from your home equity line of credit was routed through 3 different dummy corporations before landing squarely in a joint account controlled by Bradley and Valerie. He used your money to secure a prepaid 2-year lease on her penthouse apartment. He used your money to buy her that fully loaded Porsche in cash. He has been spending his days at luxury boutiques, upscale restaurants, and private spas, funding an incredibly lavish double life while completely living off your quiet hospitality. The image of Bradley snatching my mail, sweating in the freezing autumn air, flashed brilliantly through my mind. The sickening realization of his daily routine made my jaw clench. While I was tiptoeing around my own home to avoid disturbing his imaginary European conference calls, he was sitting in a high-rise penthouse laughing at the clueless old man who was actively funding his brazen infidelity. But the absolute worst part was yet to come. Victor pulled a separate, much thinner red folder from his leather briefcase and placed it deliberately next to the photos of the sports car. When a man loses his massive income, but desperately wants to maintain the illusion of elite wealth, he drains the closest available source before tapping an external line of credit. Victor said, his voice dropping to a somber, gravelly whisper. Harrison, you told us about the incident at the grocery store. The day Rachel's credit card was declined for a basic $150 purchase. I nodded slowly, remembering the sheer, unadulterated panic in my daughter's eyes as she scrambled to hide her humiliation. Bradley did not just strictly control her access to the household budget. Victor continued opening the red folder. We found the login credentials to Rachel's private savings accounts on his hidden hard drive, accounts she had before they were even married. He systematically drained every single penny she owned over the last 8 months to keep his facade intact before he finally resorted to forging your signature for the massive home equity loan. He wiped her out completely, Harrison. She is financially trapped. He left her with absolutely nothing but a hollow marriage and an empty wallet. The burning anger I had been meticulously suppressing for weeks finally flared into a white-hot, uncontrollable rage. He had not merely stolen my money. Money was ultimately replaceable. He had financially and emotionally imprisoned my only child, breaking her spirit day by day so she would never have the resources or the confidence to leave him. He had turned my vibrant, joyful daughter into a terrified hostage in her own childhood home. I took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the violent anger back down into the dark, quiet corners of my mind. I am going to completely destroy him, I said, my voice barely above a whisper laced with absolute terrifying certainty. I want the police. I want the federal wire fraud charges filed immediately. I want the police waiting for him when he walks out of that penthouse. Victor and Sarah exchanged a very long, incredibly heavy look. The atmosphere in the room suddenly shifted from analytical observation to grim, suffocating dread. Sarah slowly reached out and closed the folders detailing the stolen money and the luxury car. She reached into her dark backpack and pulled out one final, thick manila envelope. The edges were stamped with red, highly confidential medical symbols. She placed it precisely in the center of the marble table, directly in front of me, but she kept her hand firmly resting on top of it. Harrison, we can easily file the wire fraud charges and have him arrested by tomorrow morning, Sarah said, her voice dropping into a solemn, almost heartbreaking tone. The financial crimes are airtight. We have the digital footprint, the offshore routing numbers, and the undeniable proof of his aggressive forgery. She slowly pulled her hand back, leaving the thick manila envelope isolated under the bright, glaring lights of the conference room. But that is not the worst part, Harrison, she whispered, her cold, analytical eyes suddenly filled with genuine, profound sorrow. I need you to brace yourself. Look at the medical files. I stared at the thick manila envelope sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room. My hands felt unnaturally heavy and cold as I reached out and pulled the stiff paper tab open. The sharp sound of the tearing paper seemed incredibly loud in the quiet room. I slid the horrifying contents onto the cold marble table, my fingers brushing against the crisp clinical pages. The very first document was printed on expensive heavyweight stationery, bearing the highly professional embossed logo of a private, incredibly exclusive neurological clinic located in the heavily affluent northern suburbs of the city. I did not recognize the specific name of the specialized clinic, and I certainly did not recognize the name of the presiding physician. A Dr. Aris Thorne, signed with a flamboyant, arrogant flourish at the bottom of the page. I began to slowly read the detailed introductory paragraphs and a massive wave of pure, icy dread instantly paralyzed my lungs entirely. The document in my hands was a comprehensive, highly detailed psychiatric and neurological evaluation. According to this official medical record, I had been a frequent and increasingly difficult patient at this clinic for the past 6 months. The corrupt doctor had meticulously fabricated a devastating clinical history designed to destroy my credibility. He documented entirely fictitious episodes of severe memory loss, claiming I routinely forgot my own address and the names of my family members. He detailed completely invented aggressive outbursts, stating I had become combative with medical staff and a severe danger to my own daughter. He wrote that I was prone to dangerous disorientation, prone to wandering the streets at night, and completely incapable of managing basic household tasks or financial responsibilities. The final official diagnosis was stamped in bold black ink across the summary page. Stage 3 dementia. My eyes darted across the fabricated medical jargon, struggling to fully process the sheer magnitude of the evil printed before me. Bradley had not just stolen my money to fund his pathetic, shallow double life with a young fitness instructor. He had actively paid a corrupt medical professional to legally erase my entire existence. I flipped to the next page in the stack, my breath catching in my throat. It was a copy of a legal petition filed under SIL in the county probate court. Bradley was officially applying for full, uncontested legal conservatorship over my person and my entire financial estate. He had weaponized the forged dementia diagnosis to legally strip me of my human rights, presenting himself to the court as a deeply concerned, loving son-in-law who was stepping up to manage a tragic family crisis. I read the proposed execution timeline, and my stomach violently churned with a mixture of profound horror and absolute disgust. He had scheduled the final emergency court hearing for the morning of December 26th, the day after Christmas. The sheer cruelty of his timing was breathtaking. He planned to let me carve the holiday roast, watch my beloved daughter open her carefully wrapped gifts, and smile warmly for the festive family photographs by the fireplace. He would play the role of the gracious host, pouring wine and offering holiday toasts. Then the very next morning, while the discarded wrapping paper still littered the living room floor, he intended to have me legally declared incompetent and physically removed from my home by armed court deputies. The petition explicitly outlined his long-term plan to place me in a state-run, minimal-care psychiatric facility. He argued eloquently in the legal brief that the ongoing cost of private memory care would rapidly deplete the remaining family resources, completely justifying his heartbreaking decision to lock me away in a bleak, underfunded government institution. He claimed it was for my own ultimate safety and the financial protection of his wife. Once I was medically condemned, stripped of my voice, and locked behind heavy steel doors, he would have absolute unchecked legal authority. He would immediately liquidate the Lake Forest estate, empty my retirement portfolios, cash out my life insurance policies, and siphon every single remaining dollar into his fraudulent offshore accounts. Rachel would be left completely destitute, emotionally shattered, and entirely dependent on a man who despised her. The conference room was completely silent. The ambient hum of the city traffic far below seemed to fade entirely away. I looked up from the terrifying documents, my vision slightly blurred by the sheer, unadulterated evil I had just witnessed. Victor and Sarah were watching me with expressions of profound, heavy sorrow. They understood the true gravity of what I was reading. This was not simply a case of corporate embezzlement or greedy financial theft. This was an incredibly calculated, deeply malicious assassination of my life, my freedom, and my legacy. Bradley intended to bury me alive, trap my only child in a financially broken marriage, and dance on the ashes of everything I had spent 4 decades carefully building. He had constructed a flawless legal cage, and he was simply waiting for the holidays to snap the lock shut. I slowly closed the red folder and placed my hands flat down on the cold marble table. The burning, chaotic rage that had threatened to consume me earlier had completely vanished, evaporating into the chilled air. It was replaced by a chilling, absolute clarity. I did not feel any anger anymore. I felt an overwhelming, unwavering resolve that settled deep into my bones. The confused, accommodating father-in-law was dead. The ruthless corporate strategist who had survived 40 years of brutal industry warfare was fully awake and ready to strike. I looked directly across the wide marble table into Victor's sharp, calculating eyes. "Victor," I said, my voice perfectly steady, freezing cold, and echoing with unyielding authority. "I do not want a simple civil suit. I do not want a quiet, dignified settlement or a discreet, mediated divorce for Rachel. I do not just want to recover the stolen funds and kick him out of my house. I want absolute total annihilation. I want him completely stripped of his freedom, his fake reputation, and his future. I want him to experience the exact same terror and utter helplessness he planned to inflict upon me." Victor leaned back in his leather executive chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his hardened face. He reached into his tailored suit pocket and smoothly pulled out his cell phone. He looked over at Sarah, who simply offered a firm, professional nod of absolute agreement. The agonizing period of silent, covert observation within the walls of my own home was now officially over. We had gathered the necessary weapons, and we were fully prepared to strike with overwhelming, merciless force. "I will make the call right now." "Harrison," Victor replied, his voice practically vibrating with dark, triumphant anticipation. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation absolutely loves a slam-dunk bank fraud case. We are going to freeze his offshore accounts today, impound that ridiculous luxury sports car, and have him arrested directly in front of his precious, completely unsuspecting young mistress this very evening. He will absolutely never see the outside of a federal prison cell ever again." The next 2 weeks were an exercise in absolute excruciating psychological torture. I returned to the Lake Forest estate that same evening, stepping back into the chilling role of the docile, declining father-in-law. Knowing the sheer depth of Bradley's malevolence made sharing the same breathing space with him feel like inhaling pure poison. Every single morning I sat at the kitchen island and watched him parade around my house with the smug, unearned confidence of a conquering king. He barked harsh, demeaning orders at Rachel over his black coffee, criticizing the way she pressed his collars and complaining about the temperature of his breakfast. He treated my beautiful, fiercely intelligent daughter like an indentured servant, slowly grinding down her spirit with 1,000 tiny daily humiliations. And he treated me like an invisible ghost, a piece of broken furniture waiting to be hauled off to the junkyard. The absolute audacity of his daily routine was staggering. He would walk through the grand hallways I had built, admiring the crown molding and the antique fixtures, openly measuring the walls for the day. He would claim it all as his own, completely unaware of the storm brewing just beyond his sight. He truly believed he was the undisputed master of his domain, completely untouchable and superior. The contrast between the illusion he presented to Rachel and the reality he funded for his mistress was violently sickening. One Tuesday afternoon, I sat quietly in the warm, sunlit den while Bradley enthusiastically wrapped a Christmas present for my daughter. It was a flimsy, terribly cheap polyester scarf he had clearly purchased from a discount rack at the local pharmacy. I watched his thumbs fly across his smartphone screen, a sickening smirk plastered across his face as he rapidly texted Valerie. He was actively planning a lavish, sun-soaked getaway to the Caribbean, with the 24-year-old fitness instructor funding the luxury suites with the very home equity he had stolen from my estate, all while wrapping a $20 piece of synthetic fabric for the woman he had sworn to love and protect. It required every single ounce of my willpower to keep my hands folded calmly in my lap and my expression completely blank. I wanted to tear the phone from his greedy hands and throw him through the heavy glass patio doors, but I knew the federal trap required absolute, unwavering patience. I simply smiled vacuously and complimented his rapping skills, feeding his colossal ego. He actually thanked me, completely oblivious to the fact that I was actively measuring him for a federal prison uniform. While I played the perfect, helpless victim inside the walls of my home, Victor and Sarah were moving like a pair of silent, highly lethal assassins through the Chicago legal system. Victor utilized his formidable network to bypass the usual bureaucratic red tape, presenting our airtight dossier of digital evidence directly to a senior contact within the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Financial Crimes Division took one look at the forged notary stamps, the offshore routing numbers, the unauthorized wire transfers, and the fake medical records, and they immediately greenlit a full-scale coordinated strike. But Victor and Sarah wanted to ensure the cage was completely inescapable. They needed an inside witness to nail the coffin completely shut and prevent any possibility of a plea deal. Sarah meticulously tracked down Valerie. The young woman was completely oblivious to the impending disaster. She believed Bradley was a titan of industry, a brilliant investment banker who was simply going through a messy, prolonged divorce. Sarah intercepted Valerie as she was leaving her upscale private gym, sliding smoothly into the passenger seat of the silver Porsche Bradley had purchased with my stolen money. She locked the car doors and introduced herself. Sarah did not offer pleasantries or gentle introductions. She handed Valerie a thick folder containing Bradley's actual financial records, his termination papers for severe corporate embezzlement, and the irrefutable proof that her luxury lifestyle was funded entirely by stolen elder equity. Valerie learned in a matter of seconds that her wealthy older boyfriend was actually a broke, unemployed fraud, facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The sheer panic that washed over the young woman was instantaneous and profound. She was looking at serious accessory charges for receiving stolen funds across state lines. She immediately broke down into hysterical tears, frantically begging Victor to save her from the terrifying prospect of a prolonged federal prison sentence. When Victor stepped into the vehicle and smoothly offered her a highly restrictive immunity deal in exchange for her full, unmitigated cooperation, Valerie turned on Bradley faster than a striking viper. She agreed to wear a concealed wire document every single cash transfer he had routed through her accounts and hand over the keys to the luxury condominium the moment the federal agents asked for them. Bradley had built his entire treacherous empire on a foundation of lies, and his most prized asset had just handed the detonator directly to the authorities. His entire existence was heavily compromised, completely dismantled by the very woman he had sacrificed his own marriage to impress. The days bled slowly into one another until the calendar finally turned to the 24th of December. The highly anticipated Christmas Eve arrived, bringing a heavy, swirling snowstorm that blanketed the sprawling Lake Forest estate in a thick layer of pristine white. Bradley had insisted on hosting a massive, incredibly opulent holiday dinner party for his remaining circle of arrogant, fast-talking finance friends. He desperately wanted to show off the grand house pouring my vintage wines and serving expensive cuts of imported meat, playing the role of the incredibly successful patriarch at the head of the long dining table. I sat quietly near the corner of the room, dressed in a soft wool sweater, perfectly executing my role as the silent, declining old man. Rachel moved nervously around the dining room, her shoulders tense, constantly checking to ensure Bradley's wineglass was full to avoid his subtle, biting reprimands. The room roared with entitled laughter and the clinking of expensive crystal. Bradley stood at the head of the table, his chest puffed out, holding court as he spun fabricated tales of his massive imaginary market victories. He looked around the luxurious room with a deeply satisfied, incredibly greedy smile, absolutely certain that he had won. He believed that in less than 48 hours I would be locked away in a bleak psychiatric ward, and this entire kingdom would officially belong to him. He was already mentally arranging the furniture and calculating the immediate liquidation value of my antique collections, relishing the thought of throwing my entire life into a sterile dumpster. He took a long, arrogant, deeply satisfying sip of my absolute most expensive red wine, completely unaware that his house of cards was already collapsing. The massive federal trap was perfectly set. The final pieces were locked firmly into place, and the absolute destruction of Bradley's life was officially scheduled for dessert. I watched him smile at his loud, obnoxious friends, knowing it was the very last time he would ever experience true freedom. The noise in the dining room reached a deafening pitch as Bradley poured another round of my vintage Bordeaux. He held court at the head of the mahogany table, intoxicated by alcohol and his own fabricated grandiosity. I remained seated in the shadowy corner, playing the role of the docile, declining elder statesman to perfection. The crystal chandelier cast a warm glow over the prime rib, masking the treacherous reality rotting beneath the surface of this Christmas Eve gathering. The storm outside raged, sending freezing snow battering against the glass windows, but inside Bradley felt entirely untouchable. He believed he was the undisputed king of this estate. Rachel sat rigidly to his right, her slender shoulders hunched inward as if trying to make herself invisible. Her eyes were rimmed with a profound, exhausted sadness. Every time Bradley spoke, she flinched slightly, conditioned by months of relentless emotional degradation. He had methodically drained her personal savings accounts to zero, trapping her in a gilded cage while he funded a luxury penthouse for his young mistress. The sheer cruelty of his deception made my jaw clench, but I forced my facial expression to remain vacant. I could not afford to break character now. The federal trap was meticulously set, and the final sequence of events had to play out exactly as Victor and Sarah had orchestrated. Bradley laughed uproariously at a terrible joke made by a junior associate. He leaned back in his heavy dining chair, swilling the dark red wine, and his arrogant gaze eventually drifted over to my quiet corner. The festive cheer in his eyes instantly dissolved, replaced by a cold, deeply condescending sneer. He viewed me not as a human being, but as a minor inconvenience that would be permanently removed by a corrupt court order in just 48 hours. He truly believed his forged medical evaluation and fabricated dementia diagnosis were foolproof weapons. Harrison, why are you just sitting there staring at the wall? Bradley barked deliberately, drawing the attention of every guest in the room. The conversation around the table ceased. 8 pairs of eyes turned to look at me. You are making my guests incredibly uncomfortable. I thought I explicitly told you to remain upstairs in your master suite until the evening was fully concluded. I did not answer him immediately. I let my hands tremble slightly, maintaining the facade of a broken, senile old man who barely comprehended his surroundings. Rachel looked up, her face flushing a deep crimson. Bradley, please leave him alone, she whispered softly, her voice shaking with genuine fear. It is Christmas Eve. Let him stay. Bradley slammed his crystal goblet down onto the mahogany table with a sharp crack that made Rachel physically recoil. Do not interrupt me when I am speaking to your father, Rachel, he snapped viciously. I have been incredibly patient with his declining mental state. I have handled the household finances, managed his aggressive outbursts, and carried the heavy burden of this family on my shoulders. I will not have my dinner ruined by his pathetic inability to follow basic instructions. He stood up slowly, towering over the table, his chest puffed out with arrogant authority. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging nervous glances, but no one dared to speak up and defend the frail old man. Bradley pointed a rigid accusatory finger directly at my face. This is exactly why the doctors highly recommended a specialized care facility, he announced loudly. You are completely losing your grip on reality, Harrison. You are a massive burden to my wife. I am officially taking complete control of this estate. I am the master of this house now. Get up. Get out of my dining room, walk up those stairs, and lock yourself in your bedroom before I physically remove you myself. The silence that followed his vicious command was absolute and suffocating. The only sound in the house was the howling of the winter storm raging against the window panes. Rachel buried her face in her hands, weeping silently, utterly broken by the public humiliation. Bradley stood tall, completely drunk on his perceived absolute power. I stopped trembling. I placed my hands flat against the armrests of my chair and pushed myself up to a standing position. The transition was immediate. My spine straightened, erasing the hunched posture I had maintained for weeks. My shoulders squared, and the vacant expression vanished from my face, replaced by the calculating glare of a man who had destroyed corporate empires. I looked down at Rachel, my heart aching for the pain she was enduring, knowing it was about to end permanently. Then I looked dead into Bradley's eyes. I did not scream. I did not utter a single word. I just stared at him with a glacial intensity that made his sneer falter for a fraction of a second. I turned my back on the silent dining room and began to walk. My footsteps were steady and completely deliberate, echoing loudly against the polished hardwood floor of the grand foyer. I did not walk toward the grand staircase as he had explicitly commanded. I walked directly toward the heavy solid oak front door. "Where do you think you are going, Harrison?" Bradley shouted, his voice laced with sudden uncertainty as he stepped out from behind the mahogany dining table. "I gave you a direct order. You do not walk away from me when I am speaking to you." I reached the front entryway and wrapped my hand around the cold brass handle of the heavy oak door. I turned the lock with a sharp click and pulled the door wide open. The freezing Chicago wind violently roared into the grand foyer, carrying a blinding swirl of icy snowflakes that danced across the expensive Persian rug. The frigid air completely shattered the warm illusion of his lavish dinner party. Bradley scoffed loudly, attempting to regain his dominant posture in front of his wealthy associates. He marched aggressively into the foyer, crossing his arms over his chest. Running out into the blizzard like a confused child. "Are we?" he mocked, his voice dripping with pure venom. "Fine. Go freeze in the street. Do not let the door hit you on the way out." But his arrogant voice suddenly died completely in his throat. The smug, victorious smirk instantly evaporated from his flushed face, replaced by a mask of absolute paralyzing terror. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes widening to the size of saucers as he stared past my shoulder into the swirling winter darkness. Standing directly on my snow-covered front porch, illuminated by the warm yellow glow of the exterior carriage lights, were three figures wrapped in heavy dark winter coats. Victor Barnes stood in the center holding a thick leather briefcase, his face set in a grim, merciless smile. Flanking him on either side were two federal agents wearing tactical vests adorned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The agents had their hands resting casually but purposefully on their utility belts, their sharp eyes locked directly onto the sweating, trembling man standing in the center of my grand foyer. The heavy oak door stood wide open, allowing the winter storm to swirl violently across the Persian rug. Bradley remained frozen in the center of the foyer, completely paralyzed by the sight of the federal agents standing on my snow-covered porch. Victor Barnes stepped smoothly across the threshold, ignoring the biting wind, and stepped into the warm light of the entryway. He looked like an executioner. Following closely behind Victor were three tall, broad-shouldered men wearing dark navy windbreakers. The bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation were stamped boldly across their chests and backs. "Bradley Victor," said, his voice slicing through the tense silence of the house with surgical precision. "The game is officially over." The lead federal agent stepped forward, his boots leaving wet tracks on the hardwood floor. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to display a gleaming silver badge. Bradley Davis, the agent, announced, his tone entirely devoid of emotion. "We are executing a federal arrest warrant for multiple counts of wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and bank fraud." The shock sent a visible tremor through Bradley's body. The arrogant chest collapsed. The flushed confidence drained instantly from his face, leaving him a pale, sweating, pathetic shell. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. He looked back at the dining room where his wealthy finance friends were standing up from the table, their faces masks of sheer, silent horror. Then another figure stepped out from the shadows of the porch and walked into the bright light of the foyer. It was Valerie. She was no longer the vibrant, smiling woman leaning against a sports car. She looked furious, her winter coat pulled tightly around her shivering frame. She was clutching a small, dark blue velvet jewelry box tightly in her gloved hands. Her eyes locked onto Bradley with a mixture of absolute disgust and pure hatred. Bradley's eyes widened, practically bulging out of his skull, as he recognized his hidden mistress standing alongside the federal authorities. "Valerie," he choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. "What are you doing here? You cannot be here." The realization of his doom finally short-circuited his brain. The carefully constructed facade shattered, giving way to blind panic. Bradley spun around on his leather loafers and bolted. He abandoned his guests, abandoned his wife, and abandoned his kingdom, sprinting desperately down the hallway toward the rear kitchen and the back patio doors. He did not make it far. The federal agents moved with terrifying speed. 2 agents surged forward, their boots pounding against the floorboards. They caught Bradley just as he reached the center of the kitchen. One agent grabbed his shoulder, spinning him around with brutal force, while the other swept his legs out from under him. Bradley crashed hard against the edge of the granite island. The impact knocked the wind entirely out of his lungs. "Do not resist," the lead agent barked, pinning Bradley's face down against the cold stone countertop. Bradley thrashed wildly, his expensive trousers slipping on the polished tile, his arms flailing in a desperate attempt to escape. But the agents were relentless. They yanked his arms behind his back with absolute authority. The metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the shocked house was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of true justice. "Bring him back into the main room," Victor commanded from the hallway, his voice radiating control over the entire situation. The agents hauled Bradley to his feet. His pristine polo shirt was still stained with the red wine I spilled earlier, but now his face was bruised and streaked with tears. They dragged him down the hallway and pushed him into the center of the foyer. He stumbled to his knees, looking up at the crowd, witnessing his destruction. Valerie stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She stood directly over him, staring down at the pathetic man kneeling on the rug. "You told me you were a self-made millionaire." Valerie spat, her voice trembling with absolute, unrestrained fury. "You told me you managed massive international hedge funds. You told me you were a titan of industry, trapped in a miserable, loveless marriage with a useless wife." She raised her hand and violently threw the dark blue velvet jewelry box directly at his chest. It bounced off his shoulder and hit the floor. The latch popped open. Out spilled a heavy, breathtakingly beautiful diamond necklace. The sparkling stones caught the light of the crystal chandelier, throwing brilliant flashes across the walls. My breath suddenly caught. I recognized that necklace instantly. It was Martha's antique diamond necklace. I had given it to her on our 30th wedding anniversary. It had been securely locked inside the floor safe for years. Bradley had not only stolen my home equity and drained his wife's savings, he had raided my late wife's personal jewelry collection to gift expensive trinkets to his mistress. The depravity of his actions knew no bounds. "You are nothing but a broke, unemployed loser," Valerie screamed, her voice echoing loudly. "You funded our relationship with stolen money. You almost dragged me into a federal prison sentence. I gave the authorities every single bank record. I gave them all your text messages. You are finished." Valerie turned around, pulling her coat tight, and marched out the open door into the snowstorm without looking back. The agents pulled Bradley to his feet. The arrogant host of the dinner party was now a crying mess. He looked frantically around the room, scanning the shocked faces of his friends. They were already grabbing their coats, backing away as if he were a disease. Nobody wanted to be associated with a federal criminal. Bradley's panicked gaze landed on Rachel. She was standing in the arched entryway of the dining room, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with total disbelief. The emotional conditioning he subjected her to for months completely dissolved in the face of this shattering reality. "Rachel, please," Bradley begged, his voice cracking with desperation as the agents pulled him toward the front door. "You have to help me. You have to call a lawyer. This is all a massive misunderstanding. The bank made a mistake. That woman is lying. She is a stalker. You know how much I love you. Please, Rachel, tell them to stop. You have to save me." Rachel did not say a single word. She slowly lowered her hands from her face. She looked down at the glittering diamond necklace resting on the floor near his feet. She knew exactly whose necklace that was. She had watched her mother wear it on countless occasions. The horrifying truth of his ultimate betrayal washed over her features, shattering the delusion she had been living in for years. She looked at the man she promised to love, the man who secretly drained her accounts, plotted to condemn her father, and given her mother's sacred jewelry to a stranger. Rachel simply turned her back on him and walked away. The federal agents tightened their iron grip on Bradley's arms, forcefully turning him toward the open doorway, where the freezing Chicago wind continued to howl. He dragged his feet across the expensive Persian rug, his Italian leather loafers slipping against the polished hardwood. He was actively fighting the reality of his situation, his chest heaving with ragged breaths that sounded like a dying animal. Victor Barnes stepped back, allowing the agents to maneuver the broken man through the grand foyer. I did not step back. I stepped directly forward, closing the distance between us until I was standing mere inches from his bruised face. The agents paused for a fraction of a second, interpreting my movement as a father demanding a final word with the man who had just destroyed his family. Bradley looked up at me. His eyes were completely hollow, stripped of every single ounce of the towering arrogance he had displayed just 10 minutes prior. He was vibrating with pure terror. He opened his mouth perhaps to utter one final apology or to beg for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. I did not give him the opportunity to speak. I leaned in extremely close, my face hovering just beside his ear, ensuring that my words would echo in his mind for the rest of his miserable life. That $2 million mansion in the Gold Coast might be delayed, Bradley. I whispered, my voice as cold and unforgiving as the blizzard raging outside my front door. But do not worry, the federal penitentiary has plenty of room for you. Merry Christmas. A violent shudder ripped through his body as my words struck his core. He finally realized I had known everything. He realized that the frail, confused old man he had mercilessly tormented was nothing but an elaborate, highly calculated illusion designed to trap him in a cage of his own making. The federal agents did not give him time to process the revelation. They shoved him forward, marching him out into the blinding white snowstorm. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them with a resounding boom that shook the framed artwork hanging on the foyer walls. The profound silence that followed was deafening. The grand house, previously vibrating with the obnoxious laughter of his entitled associates, was now as quiet as a mausoleum. I slowly turned around to face the dining room. Bradley's esteemed guests were in a state of absolute frantic panic. They were scrambling toward the hall closet like terrified rats fleeing a sinking ship. Men in tailored suits and women in expensive evening gowns were violently shoving their arms into winter coats, completely abandoning their half-eaten prime rib and the expensive crystal glasses filled with my vintage wine. Nobody offered a polite farewell. They simply wanted to escape the immediate proximity of a massive federal crime scene. Within 3 minutes, every single parasitic guest had vanished into the freezing winter night. I stood alone in the grand foyer, listening to the roar of luxury car engines speeding away down the snow-covered driveway. The grand dinner party was completely over. The stage play was finished. I walked slowly back into the dining room, stepping over the discarded linen napkins and the spilled red wine that stained the mahogany table. Rachel was standing near the arched entryway, staring blankly at the vacant space where her husband had just been standing. She slowly lowered her gaze to the floor, her eyes fixing heavily on the antique diamond necklace that Valerie had violently thrown in disgust. The glittering stones seemed to mock the absolute destruction of her marriage. A harsh sob suddenly ripped through the quiet room. Rachel's knees buckled completely. She collapsed onto the plush velvet sofa in the adjoining living room, curling her body into a tight, defensive ball. She buried her face deep into her hands, weeping uncontrollably. The sound of her profound heartbreak echoed endlessly throughout the empty house. I did not rush to comfort her immediately. I did not offer platitudes or wrap my arms around her trembling shoulders. She had lived inside a fantasy for years, deliberately closing her eyes to the financial manipulations because the terrifying truth was simply too painful to acknowledge. If I coddled her now, if I shielded her from the harsh reality, I would be doing her a massive disservice. She needed to feel the absolute bottom of the abyss before she could ever begin the arduous process of climbing back out. I walked slowly into the living room, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. I sat down heavily on the velvet sofa beside my weeping daughter. I stared straight ahead at the crackling flames dancing in the stone fireplace, giving her the necessary space to let the initial shock physically wash over her. Her sobs eventually began to subside, transitioning into quiet hiccups. She slowly lowered her hands, revealing a face streaked with devastation. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for a simple, comforting lie. She wanted me to tell her that we could easily fix this, that the stolen money would simply be returned tomorrow, and that her life would transition back to normalcy. I turned my head and looked directly into her tear-filled eyes. My expression remained entirely neutral. "The parasite has been permanently removed from this house, Rachel." I stated, my voice incredibly firm and entirely devoid of any soft parental cushioning. "Bradley is completely gone and he is never coming back. But you need to understand the absolute gravity of the wreckage he has left behind. You cannot hide from this reality any longer." I pointed a steady finger toward the dining room. "He systematically drained every single penny from your private savings accounts over the last 8 months. Your personal checking accounts are entirely overdrawn. Your credit cards are completely maxed out with fraudulent charges he manufactured to maintain his pathetic illusion of wealth. He forged my signature to steal $800,000 from the equity of this very estate to purchase sports cars and luxury apartments for a woman who despised you. He wiped you out entirely, Rachel. You currently possess absolutely zero financial resources. You do not own the clothes hanging in your closet, and you do not own the expensive vehicle sitting in the garage." The painful truth finally registered in her exhausted eyes. The remaining protective walls of her deep denial completely crumbled, leaving her entirely exposed to the freezing reality of her situation. She had surrendered her entire independence to a monster. "You are financially destitute, Rachel," I continued, my tone dropping to a low, serious register. "The federal government will freeze everything tomorrow. Your real trial does not end tonight with his arrest. Your real trial is just beginning. You are going to have to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet, rebuild your entire existence from absolute scratch, and finally become the strong, independent woman your mother raised you to be. I will provide a roof over your head, but I will not simply hand you a check to fix this massive disaster. You have to fight for your own survival now." The freezing winter gradually melted into a surprisingly mild and hesitant spring. 3 long, exhausting months had passed since that chaotic Christmas Eve when the federal agents dragged Bradley out of my home and completely shattered his pathetic, fabricated reality. The ensuing legal fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. When faced with an absolute mountain of irrefutable digital evidence, offshore banking records, and Valerie's damning, fully cooperative testimony, Bradley's high-priced defense attorney immediately advised him to surrender. There was absolutely no viable path to victory for a man who had left such an incredibly arrogant and sloppy trail. He officially pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges, including aggravated identity theft, severe bank fraud, and extensive wire fraud. I sat quietly in the polished wooden pews of the federal courthouse and watched him stand before the stern, unyielding judge. Stripped of his tailored suits and his expensive watch, wearing a standard-issue drab orange jumpsuit, he looked incredibly small and utterly unremarkable. The judge did not display a single ounce of leniency toward a man who had actively preyed upon an elderly family member. Bradley was sentenced to 12 consecutive years in a federal penitentiary without the slightest possibility. His fake European hedge funds, his luxury penthouse, and his imaginary empire evaporated into the cold air. Furthermore, Victor Barnes worked tirelessly to untangle the massive financial mess Bradley had deliberately created. Armed with the irrefutable proof of his forgery and the federal convictions, Victor successfully forced the bank to completely reverse the fraudulent $800,000 home equity line of credit. My beloved Lake Forest estate was finally safe, completely clear of any remaining toxic liens. The immediate crisis was officially resolved, but the deeply inflicted emotional wounds within my own home remained raw, painful, and actively bleeding. Rachel officially filed for divorce the very same week Bradley was transferred to the federal correctional facility. The heavy, oppressive shadow of his constant emotional abuse was finally lifted from her shoulders, but the sudden, blinding exposure to absolute reality left her entirely disoriented. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, she came into my private study. She sat down in the leather armchair across from my desk, nervously twisting her wedding ring, which she had finally removed from her finger, but still carried in her pocket. She had spent the last 3 months living quietly in her childhood bedroom, eating the food I purchased, and slowly recovering from the initial shock. But now the pressing reality of her completely empty bank accounts and her deeply uncertain future was closing in around her. "Dad," she began, her voice trembling slightly, with a mixture of profound exhaustion and lingering expectation. "My lawyer needs a significant retainer to finalize the divorce proceedings, and I have been looking at a few small, secure apartments downtown. I was hoping we could discuss a financial arrangement. I just need a comfortable cushion to help me start my life over again." She looked up at me with those familiar pleading eyes, fully expecting me to simply reach into my desk drawer, pull out my checkbook, and instantly erase all of her complicated problems. For her entire life, from her childhood through her disastrous marriage, someone else had always paved the road and paid the toll. I looked at my beautiful daughter, my heart aching with a fierce, protective love, and I did exactly what I should have done a decade ago. I firmly closed my desk drawer and folded my hands over the mahogany surface. "No, Rachel," I replied, my voice perfectly calm, steady, and devoid of any accommodating warmth. "I am not going to write you a blank check. I am not going to blindly fund a luxury apartment downtown, and I am not going to simply hand you a comfortable living allowance." Her eyes widened in genuine, unadulterated shock. A sudden flush of deep color rushed to her pale cheeks. "But Dad, I have absolutely nothing left," she stammered, her voice rising in pitch. "Bradley stole every single dollar I had to my name. I am completely broke. How am I supposed to survive and start over without your help?" "You are going to survive by finally learning how to support yourself," I answered, maintaining my unyielding gaze. "Bradley was a vicious parasite, Rachel, but he was able to easily trap you because you were completely financially dependent on him. You traded your absolute independence for the comfortable illusion of luxury, and it nearly cost both of us our entire lives. I refuse to be the next person you blindly depend on. I absolutely refuse to raise a 30-year-old dependent." The harshness of my words struck her like a physical blow. She recoiled, slightly, fresh tears welling up in her eyes. It was a brutal, incredibly difficult awakening, but it was absolutely necessary for her ultimate survival. I leaned forward, softening my tone just a fraction, but refusing to retreat from the boundary I had finally established. "I love you more than anything in this entire world, Rachel," I continued softly. "And because I truly love you, I am going to help you rebuild your life the correct way. I will fully pay for your ongoing weekly therapy sessions, because you need to heal from the severe emotional abuse you endured. I will also completely pay your university tuition, so you can finally finish the graduate degree you abandoned when you married that monster. But that is the absolute extent of my financial contribution." I paused, letting the reality of the strict parameters fully settle into her mind. "If you want a secure apartment downtown, you will have to go out and get a job to pay your own rent. If you want to buy new clothes or go out to dinner with your friends, you will have to earn the paycheck to fund it. You are going to learn the true value of hard work, discipline, and absolute self-reliance. You are going to build a life that no man can ever take away from you again." Rachel sat in silence for a very long time. The initial shock and defensive anger slowly drained from her posture. She looked down at the empty wedding band resting in the palm of her hand. For 10 years, she had allowed herself to be diminished, controlled, and completely silenced by a man who valued her only as a convenient prop for his fabricated life. She had forgotten how to fight for herself. I watched her process the difficult path I was forcing her to walk. There would be no easy rescue, no magic bailout, and no comfortable shortcuts. She slowly closed her hand into a tight fist, clutching the discarded ring. When she finally lifted her head to look at me, the tears had completely stopped falling. The familiar, helpless expression of the constant victim was entirely gone. In its place, shining clearly through the profound exhaustion and lingering fear, I saw a bright, undeniable spark of genuine resilience. It was a fierce, determined light that I had not seen in my daughter's eyes since she was a young, ambitious girl. She finally nodded her head once. I stepped out onto the wide wooden porch of the Lake Forest estate and took a long, deep breath of the crisp spring morning air. The brutal, freezing winter had finally retreated, leaving behind a vibrant green lawn and the gentle, melodic chirping of songbirds nesting in the ancient oak trees. I stood there for a quiet moment, holding a warm ceramic mug of strong black coffee, and simply admired the absolute stillness of my property. The house behind me was entirely quiet, profoundly peaceful, and undeniably mine. There were no more arrogant demands echoing down the grand hallways. There were no more deceitful phone calls echoing from the private study. The suffocating, toxic cloud that Bradley had meticulously dragged into my home had completely evaporated, blown away by the harsh but cleansing winds of federal justice. A small, reliable sedan pulled slowly into the circular driveway, crunching softly against the gravel. The driver's side door opened, and Rachel stepped out into the morning sunlight. She was wearing a simple, understated uniform for her new position at a downtown marketing firm. She looked incredibly tired, her shoulders bearing the physical weight of long hours and demanding responsibilities, but her eyes held a brilliant, undeniable spark that outshone her exhaustion. She was genuinely proud of herself. For the very first time in her adult life, she was paying her own rent, managing her own budget, and building a secure future entirely with her own 2 hands. I smiled warmly as she walked up the stone steps, handing her a freshly brewed travel mug of coffee, before she headed off to begin her demanding shift. We did not need to exchange profound words of encouragement. The quiet, mutual respect hovering between us was more than enough. As I watched her car disappear down the winding suburban road, I leaned back in my favorite wicker chair and allowed my mind to drift back over the chaotic events of the past year. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal still possessed the power to chill my blood. A man I had welcomed into my family, a man who had eaten at my table and slept under my roof, had actively plotted to erase my existence. He had weaponized my age, fabricated a devastating mental decline, and sought to imprison me in a state facility just to steal my life savings. Surviving that level of pure, concentrated malice required a tremendous amount of cold, calculated patience. I had to suppress my natural instincts, swallow my burning pride, and play the role of a defeated, broken old man, while Victor and Sarah quietly assembled the federal guillotine. It was the most difficult acting performance of my entire life, but the absolute crushing victory made every single moment of forced docility entirely worth the struggle. I did not just defeat Bradley. I completely eradicated his fraudulent empire and secured the freedom of my daughter. The path to this peaceful morning was undeniably harsh. When Rachel initially filed for divorce, she expected a gentle, comfortable landing. She assumed my vast wealth would automatically insulate her from the terrifying consequences of her shattered marriage. I deliberately refused to provide that insulation. I paid her tuition and covered her medical therapy, but I forced her to earn her own rent money. The resulting transformation in her character was miraculous to witness. She shed the helpless victim persona and embraced a powerful, enduring strength. She is no longer waiting to be rescued by anyone. That grueling period of tough love forged an unbreakable bond between us. The deceptive shadows that once haunted this property are entirely banished. The warm spring sunlight currently illuminating my wooden porch is a fitting reflection of my reality. I survived the darkest storm of my life by trusting my instincts and striking back with merciless precision. Now I simply get to enjoy the absolute, quiet victory of a long and difficult battle. They say family is the one place you must offer unconditional forgiveness. They are wrong. When tolerance is mistaken for stupidity and your home is turned into a goldmine for a parasite, the only forgiveness you owe them is a direct ticket to a federal prison cell. You cannot buy respect, and you cannot shield your children from the pain they need to experience to grow up. True love sometimes means letting them fall hard. I lost my illusion of a perfect family, but I gained back my dignity, my home, and ultimately, my real daughter. If this story of betrayal and justice resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments below. Have you ever had to cut off a toxic family member? Where are you watching from today? Stay sharp and stay safe.